Welcome to our next session on the Conquest Session 26. We are still introducing 1st and 2nd Kings. At this point, we want to look at the theme of judgment and repentance in these books. One cannot come away from a reading of 1st and 2nd Kings without being impressed with the central role that judgment plays in the books. The once unified Israel was torn apart into two kingdoms as a judgment upon Solomon for his unfaithfulness to God in 1 Kings chapter 11. And the two kingdoms both fell to foreign powers as judgment for their sins, as we've already mentioned in 2 Kings 17, 7 through 23, and chapter 24, verses 3 and 4. The history of the two nations followed a long downward trajectory. To scholars such as Martin note, this downward trend and the strong theme of judgment accompanying it form the main reason for the writing of the books. As we have seen, however, this is an overly pessimistic view. Accompanying the theme of judgment is a pronounced emphasis upon repentance. The Hebrew root, usually translated repentance, denotes a turning away from evil and toward the good. In key passages in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, we find that idea coming to the front. For example, in Samuel's farewell speech, he exhorts the people to follow the Lord in 1 Samuel 12, 14, and 15. And he urges them not to turn away from the Lord and not to turn away after useless idols, verses 20 and 21. In Solomon's great temple prayer in 1 Kings chapter 8, 5 times he mentions the people turning back to God or repenting. A repeated theme in this prayer is the request that God be attentive to his people when they turn and cry out to him. 7 times he asks God to hear from heaven and be gracious to them. In his great reflective summary as to why Israel fell to Assyria, the author of these books reiterates what God had repeatedly said to him or said to his people. Turn away from your evil ways. Observe my commands and decrees in accordance with the entire law that I commanded your fathers to obey, and that I delivered to you through my servants the prophets. 2 Kings 17:13. And in high praise for Josiah, the author tells us that there was no one like this king who turned to the Lord with his entire being. Chapter 23, verse 25. The call to repentance has its roots in God's graciousness, or, to put it another way, in God's goodness. That is, Israel must have something to turn to, and the object of Israel's turning is God and the goodness that he represents. Walter Brueggemann has shown how the pattern of God's goodness is found at critical points throughout Deuteronomy and the following books. In 1st and 2nd Kings, Solomon affirms God's good promises, literally every good word, and how not one word of them has failed, 1 Kings 8:56. This is a sentiment that was already expressed in Joshua's day, in Joshua 21:45 and Joshua 23:14 and 15. In Solomon's declaration, the good word was not merely oriented toward the past. Verse 57 looks to the future. May the Lord our God be with us as he was with our fathers. May he never leave us nor forsake us. Brueggemann notes that God's good word is expressed in visible ways through the Davidic line in 1st and 2nd Kings, which brings us back to the theme of the Davidic kingdom and the kingdom of God discussed earlier. God not only said good words to Israel, but he also did good things. And this was a source of joy and gladness to his people, 1 Kings 8:66. Even at the end of 2 Kings, we see the Babylonian king speaking kindly to Jehoiachin in 2 Kings 25:28. The word in question is literally good. As Brueggemann notes, the Davidic house is still the bearer of Yahweh's good. This brings us to the text of 1 Kings. In 1 Kings chapter 1 and verse 1, or actually verses 1 through 10, we see Adonijah as an opportunist. Adonijah was David's oldest living son, and he was probably about 35 years old at this time. David's firstborn, Amnon, was killed by Absalom. His second son, Chileab, or Daniel, may have died young because there's no record of his life. And the third son, Absalom, was killed by Joab in 1 Chronicles 3:1 and 2. Evidently, as David's oldest son, Adonijah felt that he deserved the throne. After all, his father was a sick man who would soon die, and it was important that there be a king on the throne of Israel. Like his older brother Absalom, Adonijah seized his opportunity when David wasn't at his best and was bedfast. However, Adonijah underestimated the stamina and wisdom of the old warrior and ultimately paid for his pride with his life. Abishag became a companion and nurse for David and was officially considered a concubine. She will become a very important person in the drama after David's death. Adonijah made the mistake of thinking that his father was unable to function normally and therefore would be unable to interfere with his plans, but he was wrong. Instead of being a sympathetic son, Adonijah decided to claim the throne for himself. If he won the support of his siblings, the government leaders, the priests, and the army, he could pull off a coup and become the next king. Following the example of his infamous brother Absalom, Adonijah began to promote himself and generate popular support. Like Absalom, he was a handsome man who had been pampered by his father, and the unthinking people joined his crusade. Wisely, Adonijah got the support of both the army and the priesthood by enlisting Joab the general and Abiathar the high priest. Both of these men had served David for years, and they had stood with him during his most difficult trials, but now they were turning against him. Yet Adonijah knew that the Lord had chosen Solomon to be Israel's next king, and Abiathar and Joab certainly understood this as well. When the Lord gave David his covenant in 2 Samuel 7, he indicated that a future son would succeed him and build the temple. And that son was Solomon. Adonijah, Abiathar, and Joab were rebelling against the revealed will of God, forgetting that, according to Psalm 33:11, the counsel of the Lord stands forever. Again, like his brother Absalom, Adonijah hosted a great feast and invited all his brothers except Solomon. He also ignored several other important leaders in the kingdom, including Zadok the high priest, Benaiah the leader of the king's personal guard, Nathan the prophet, and David's mighty men. This was a coronation feast, and the guests were proclaiming Adonijah as king of Israel. Perhaps some of them thought that the ailing King David had actually laid his hands on Adonijah and named him king. After all, Adonijah's brothers were at the feast, which suggested they made no claim to the throne. But surely the guests were aware of the absence of Solomon and Zadok and Benaiah and Nathan. And did anyone ask when and where Nathan had anointed Adonijah? And if he had been anointed, why the event was so secret? The faithful servants of God and of David had been left out, an obvious clue that Adonijah had named himself as king without any authority from David or the Lord. Adonijah's great feast was the signal David's loyal servants needed to inform David that it was time to name Solomon the next king of Israel. In verses 11 through 53, we see Nathan taking a position of loyalty to his king, as well as a kind of a leader in this effort. If ever King David had a loyal friend and advisor, it was the prophet Nathan. Nathan brought the good news about God's covenant with David and his descendants, 2 Samuel 7, 1 through 17. And Nathan also shepherded David through those dark days after the king's adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah. Nathan must have had musical gifts as well, because he helped David organize the worship in the sanctuary in 2 Chronicles 29, 25, and 26. When Solomon was born, Nathan told the parents that the Lord wanted the boy also named Jedediah, which means beloved of the Lord, 2 Samuel 12, 24 and 25. When Nathan heard about Adonijah's feast and his claim to the throne, he immediately went to work. In verses 11 through 14, Nathan informed Bathsheba of what was going on. Though we haven't read anything about Bathsheba since the birth of Solomon, we must not conclude that she had been unimportant in the affairs of the palace. Her conduct in this chapter alone is evidence that she was a courageous woman who wanted to do the will of God. To be sure, it was her son who was to be the next king, and had Adonijah succeeded in gaining the throne, both Bathsheba and her son would probably have been killed. But the fact that Nathan turned immediately to Bathsheba suggests that he knew what the future queen mother could do. Also, the way Adonijah approached her and Solomon received her indicates that both men recognized her as a woman of influence. It's unfortunate that too many people think of Bathsheba only as the adulteress, when it was her intervention that saved Israel from a disaster at a critical hour. In verses 15 through 21, Bathsheba informs David of what's going on. The prophet had given Bathsheba the words to speak, a brief statement of only 2 questions that she expanded into a very moving speech. A key word in the dialogue of this entire scenario is swear. It's used in verses 13, 17, 29, and 30. Nathan and Bathsheba knew that David had promised that Solomon would be the next king because Solomon was God's choice. David had publicly announced the appointment of Solomon when he announced the building of the temple. When God gave the special name of Jedediah to Solomon, this certainly suggested that he would be David's successor. Bathsheba bowed before the king and then reminded him of his oath that Solomon would be the next king of Israel. She then informed him that Adonijah was hosting a coronation banquet and that Abiathar and Joab were there with all the royal sons except Solomon. Obviously, the banquet was not to honor Solomon. Adonijah had proclaimed himself king, but all Israel was waiting for David's official word concerning his successor. Her next point was the obvious fact that if Adonijah became king, he would quickly get rid of both Bathsheba and her son. What David did was a matter of life or death. Abishag was witness to all that Bathsheba said. In verses 22 through 27, we find Nathan coming into the picture in informing David again of what's going on. While Bathsheba was speaking to her husband, Nathan came into the palace and was announced, so Bathsheba left the room and Nathan entered the bedchamber. He asked the king 2 questions. Did David announce that Adonijah would sit on his throne? And had the king done this in secret without telling his servant the prophet? Sandwiched between these 2 questions was his report that Adonijah was now celebrating his coronation. All the king's sons except Solomon were at the feast, and so were Abiathar and all the military commanders. Nathan didn't mention Joab, but Bathsheba had already done that. What Nathan revealed was that Joab had brought his officers with him, so the army was backing Adonijah. However, David's loyal servants, Nathan, Zadok, and Benaiah, had been ignored. That being the case, Nathan wondered if Adonijah really had the authority to proclaim himself king. It's very likely that Nathan's telling of these facts brought to David's memory the terrible days of Absalom's rebellion, and he didn't want the nation to experience another civil war. Solomon was a man of peace. Reared in the palace, he had no experience of war as did his father, and if there was a civil war, how could he build the temple? In verses 28 through 37, we see David instructing his servants what to do. David responded immediately to the crisis, and he told Nathan to call Bathsheba back to his bedside. The two were alone. David spoke to Bathsheba and reaffirmed the fact that her son Solomon was to be the next king of Israel. He had sworn this to her privately and would not back down on his oath. But then David went even further and made Solomon his co-regent that very day. If David waited too long, Adonijah's rebellion could grow in strength, and after David died, who would have the authority to act? By making Solomon his co-regent immediately, David stayed in control and Solomon would do his bidding. Solomon was no longer merely prince or even heir apparent. He was now co-regent with his father and the king of Israel. David then asked them to call his loyal servants, Nathan the prophet, Zadok the priest, and Benaiah the head of his personal bodyguard, men he knew he could trust. He instructed them to proclaim Solomon king in a public demonstration at Gihon. This was an important place of springs on the eastern slope of Mount Zion, less than a mile up the valley, north from En Rogel, where Adonijah was hosting his great feast. It wouldn't take long for the news to get to Adonijah. Solomon was to ride David's royal mule, and it was to be announced that Solomon was sharing David's throne as king and would be David's successor. Zadok and Nathan were to anoint Solomon with the holy anointing oil from the tabernacle. The trumpet would be blown, declaring to the people that this was an official event. Solomon was now king and ruler over all Israel and Judah. Benaiah was the son of a priest, but he chose a military career and became one of David's mighty men, as we saw earlier. He also became the leader of David's personal guard, the Cherethites and the Pelethites. After hearing David's instructions, Benaiah spoke up enthusiastically in agreement, and thus gave both David and Solomon the support of the soldiers under his command. Later, Solomon would execute Joab for his treachery in following Adonijah, and he would give his position to Benaiah. Benaiah was as loyal to Solomon as he had been to David. Zadok, Nathan, and Benaiah, protected by David's personal troops, obeyed David's instructions to the letter, and they announced to all Israel that Solomon was king. The people were ecstatic as they played their musical instruments and shouted, "God save King Solomon." This shout echoed down the valley and reached En Rogel, where the people were shouting, "God save King Adonijah." As they finished their meal, Adonijah and his guests heard the shouting and the sound of the trumpet and wondered what was going on in Jerusalem. Had David died? Was it a declaration of war? Well, their questions were answered by the arrival of Jonathan, the son of Abiathar the priest, who had assisted David during Absalom's rebellion. Adonijah thought that Jonathan was bringing good news, but it turned out to be the worst possible news for Adonijah, Abiathar, and Joab. Jonathan's report is that of an eyewitness who saw Solomon riding the king's mule and watched as Zadok and Nathan anointed the new king. Jonathan made it clear that Solomon was at that very moment the king of Israel. Adonijah, his fellow conspirators, and his guests knew what that meant. They were all under great suspicion. The guests, including the brothers of Adonijah and Solomon, all rose up and fled back to the city for safety, and Adonijah fled to the tabernacle for asylum. This was the tent in Jerusalem, which housed the ark. The tabernacle with the other furnishings was at Gibeon. There was an altar there, and Adonijah took hold of the horns of the altar, which is what people in danger did before the establishment of the 6 cities of refuge. A place of asylum at least delayed judgment and gave the accused an opportunity for a hearing. Solomon showed mercy to his brother and allowed him to return to his home in Jerusalem. This amounted to house arrest because the king's guards would keep Adonijah under constant surveillance. But Solomon also warned his brother to be careful how he behaved, for as an insurgent, Adonijah was worthy of death. If he stepped out of line, he would be executed. Adonijah bowed before Solomon, but his heart was submitted neither to the Lord nor his brother. Well, this brings us to 1 Kings chapter 2. David served his own generation by the will of God, according to Acts 13:36. But he was also concerned about Solomon and the next generation. David had his enemies, some of whom were in his own household and inner circle, and he wanted to be certain that the new king did not inherit old problems. During his long reign of 40 years, David had unified the nation, defeated their foreign enemies, successfully organized kingdom affairs, and made more than adequate preparation for the building of the temple. He sang his last song in 2 Samuel 23, 1-7, and then he gave his last charge to Solomon. He tells Solomon in verses 1-4 to put the Lord first. The Old Testament records the last words of Jacob in Genesis 49, of Moses in Deuteronomy 33, of Joshua in Joshua 23, 1-24-27, and the last words of David here in 1 Kings 2, 1-11. He says, I go the way of all the earth. And this is a quotation from Joshua at the end of his life. He also says, be strong and show yourself a man, which sounds like the Lord's words to Joshua at the start of his ministry. From the very outset of his reign, he would have to make some tough decisions and issue some difficult orders. David had already commissioned Solomon regarding building the temple, a task that would take 7 years. One day, Solomon would come to the end of his life, and David wanted him to be able to look back with satisfaction. Blessed is that person whose heart is right with God, whose conscience is clear, and who can look back and say with Jesus in John 17:4, I have glorified you on the earth. I have finished the work which you have given me to do. David also reminded his son of the special covenant that the Lord had made concerning the Davidic dynasty. He warned Solomon that if he disobeyed God's law, he would bring discipline and sorrow to himself and the land. But if he obeyed God's commandments, God would bless him and the people. More importantly, God would see to it that there was also always a descendant of David sitting on the throne. David knew that Israel had a ministry to perform in providing the vehicle for the promised Redeemer to come to earth. And the future of God's redemptive plan rested with Israel. How tragic that Solomon did not fully follow God's law and was the means of promoting idolatry in the land and then causing the kingdom to be divided. In verses 5-9, David tells Solomon to protect the kingdom. David knew that there were perils lurking in the shadows in the kingdom, and he warned Solomon to act immediately and deal with 2 dangerous men. Joab, commander of David's army, was the first to be named. He had stood by David through many difficult trials, but from time to time he had asserted his own will and been guilty of murdering innocent men. Joab was David's nephew and the brother of Abishai and Asahel, and all of them were noted warriors. But Joab killed Abner because Abner had killed Asahel. And Joab also killed David's son Absalom, even though he knew David wanted him taken alive. He murdered Amasa, whom David had appointed leader of his forces, and he supported Adonijah in his quest for the throne. The second dangerous man was Shimei. He was a Benjamite and a relative of Saul who wanted to see Saul's line restored to the throne. He cursed David when David was fleeing from Absalom, as we have seen. To curse the king was a violation of the law. But David accepted this unkindness as a discipline from the Lord. Later, when David returned to the throne, Shimei humbled himself before the king, and David forgave him. But David knew there was always a pro-Saul element in the northern tribes, so he warned Solomon to keep Shimei under surveillance. David not only remembered dangerous men like Joab and Shimei, but he also remembered helpful men like Barzillai, who had provided him and his people with what they needed when they fled from Absalom. David had wanted to reward Barzillai with a place at his table, but the old man preferred to die in his own home. He asked David to give him the honor, give the honor to his son Kimham, but now David instructed Solomon to care for Barzillai's sons and not Kimham alone. David did go the way of all the earth, and he died in a good old age, full of days and riches and honor. Solomon was already king, and his throne was secure, so there was no need for any official decisions or ceremonies. In 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 12 through 46, we see Solomon as a good strategist. The new king had his agenda all prepared. Deal with Joab, deal with Shimei, reward the sons of Barzillai, and build the temple. But his first major crisis came from his half-brother Adonijah. Adonijah's request was given through Bathsheba. Solomon had graciously accepted Adonijah's submission to the new regime, although Solomon certainly knew that the man was deceitful and ready to strike again. The fact that Adonijah went to the queen mother with his request suggests that he expected her to have great influence with her son. Adonijah's declaration in verse 15 shows how confused he was in his thinking. For if Solomon was God's choice for the throne, and Adonijah knew it, why did he attempt a coup and try to seize the crown? Students differ in their interpretation of Bathsheba's role in this scenario. Some say she was very naive in even asking Solomon, but Bathsheba had already proved herself to be a courageous and influential woman. It's very likely that she knew exactly what she was doing here. The fact is that by having Abishag as a wife, Adonijah was making a claim to the throne. This is what happened in 2 Samuel 16, 20 through 23, where Absalom publicly went in to David's concubines. Therefore, Bathsheba, in this case with Adonijah, is helping Solomon secure his throne by removing Adonijah as a threat. Whether she was doing this from selfish motives, making sure that she and Solomon did not die, as we saw above, or whether she was doing it from pure motives, making sure God's choice for king remained on the throne, or both, we can't be sure about either one. But the end is the same. Adonijah is killed, and the threat to the throne is removed. But Solomon didn't stop there. He also removed Abiathar from being priest, and he sent him into retirement at the priestly city of Anathoth, about 3 miles from Jerusalem. In deposing Abiathar, Solomon fulfilled the prophecy given to Eli that his family would not continue in the priesthood. Zadok was made high priest in his place. Solomon recognized the fact that Abiathar had faithfully served his father David, so he didn't have him executed. Joab no doubt had an efficient spy system, and when he heard the news that Adonijah had been killed, he knew he was next on the list. He fled to the tabernacle David had erected in Jerusalem for the Ark of the Covenant, and there he claimed asylum by taking hold of the horns of the altar. However, only people who were guilty of manslaughter could do this and claim the right to a trial. And Joab was guilty of both murder and disloyalty to King David and King Solomon. Joab defied both Benaiah and Solomon by refusing to come out of the sacred area, but Solomon was not to be treated in such an arrogant manner by a man who was obviously a traitor and a murderer. Though he was a soldier, Benaiah belonged to a priestly family, so it was legal for him to enter the sacred area, and he went and killed Joab at the altar and then buried him. Solomon then promoted Benaiah to be commander of the army in place of Joab. It's important to understand that Solomon wasn't simply acting in revenge in the place of his father David. Solomon explained that the death of Joab took away the stain of the innocent blood that Joab had shed when he killed Abner and Amasa. The shedding of innocent blood polluted the land, according to Numbers 35, 30 through 34. And the victim's blood cried out to God for vengeance. The cities of refuge were provided for people who had accidentally killed somebody. They could flee to one of the 6 cities and be protected until the elders had investigated the case. But murderers like Joab were not to be given any mercy, but were to be executed so that the innocent blood they had shed would pollute the land no more. Saul's treatment of the Gibeonites had polluted the land and created trouble for David, and therefore, again, the killing of Saul's descendants in 2 Samuel 21 was not a sin. And Solomon didn't want that kind of thing to happen during his reign. Next, we see Shimei again. Since Shimei was related to Saul, he was a potential troublemaker who might arouse the tribe of Benjamin against the new king, and perhaps even stir up the 10 northern tribes of Israel. David had brought unity and peace to the nation, and Solomon didn't want Shimei creating problems. He ordered him to move to Jerusalem, build himself a house, and stay in the city. If he left the city and crossed the Kidron Valley, he would die. Jerusalem wasn't that large a city at that time, so Solomon's men could keep their eyes on the Benjamite, who had cursed David and thrown dirt and stones at him. Shimei obeyed for 3 years, but then he disobeyed. When 2 of his slaves ran away and went 25 miles to Gath, Shimei decided to go personally and bring them back. Surely he could have hired somebody else to go get the slaves, but he went himself. Perhaps he thought he had fulfilled the terms of the agreement, or maybe he thought the guards weren't watching him. Most likely he was deliberately defying Solomon and pushing the limits to see what he would do. Well, he found out. Solomon knew that Shimei had left Jerusalem, and when he returned, the king confronted him with his crime. Solomon delivered a brief but powerful speech that condemned him for what he did to David and what he had just done to Solomon, and it ended with Benaiah executing Shimei the traitor. Solomon was to be a man of peace, and yet he began his reign by ordering 3 executions. But true peace must be based on righteousness, not sentiment. James 3:17 says that wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable. The land was polluted by the innocent blood that Joab had shed, and the land could be cleansed only by the execution of the murderer. David didn't execute Joab, even after Joab killed Absalom, because David knew that he himself had blood on his hands. David was guilty of asking Joab to shed Uriah's innocent blood, but Solomon's hands were clean. Solomon was indeed a man of peace, and he achieved that peace by bringing about righteousness in the land. This brings us to 1 Kings chapters 3 and 4, where we see Solomon seeking wisdom. When Solomon ascended the throne, the people of Israel soon learned that he was not another David. He was a scholar, not a soldier, a man more interested in erecting buildings than fighting battles. David enjoyed the simple life of a shepherd, but Solomon chose to live in luxury. Both David and Solomon wrote songs, but Solomon is better known for his proverbs. We have many of David's songs in the book of Psalms, but except for Psalms 72 and 127 and the Song of Solomon, we have none of Solomon's 3,000 songs. David was a shepherd who loved and served God's flock, while Solomon became a celebrity who used the people to help support his extravagant lifestyle. When David died, the people mourned. After Solomon died, the people begged his successor King Rehoboam to lighten the heavy yoke his father had put on their necks. David was a warrior who put his trust in God. Solomon was a politician who put his trust in authority, treaties, and achievement. According to Frederick Buechner, King Solomon was among the wisest fools who ever wore a crown. Solomon is mentioned nearly 300 times in the Old Testament and a dozen times in the New Testament. He's listed in the genealogy of Jesus Christ in Matthew 1, and he is cited as an example of splendor in Matthew 6 and Luke 12, an example of wisdom in Matthew 12 and Luke 11. He is identified as the builder of the temple. One of the colonnades in the temple was named after him, and his father David was recognized as the ideal leader, and his record became the standard by which every succeeding king of Judah was measured. However, nobody pointed to Solomon as a good example of a godly leader. Chapters 3 and 4 describe events that occurred during the first 3 years of Solomon's reign, before he began to build the temple, and they describe Solomon in several roles. First, he's seen as a peacemaker. Solomon's name comes from the Hebrew word shalom, which means peace, as we have seen. And during his reign, the kingdom was at peace with its neighbors. His father David had risked his life on the battlefield to defeat enemy nations and claim their lands for Israel. But Solomon took a different approach to international diplomacy. He made treaties with other rulers by marrying their daughters, which helps to explain why he had 700 wives who were princesses, as well as 300 concubines. Yet Moses in the law warned Jewish kings not to multiply wives. His first bride after he became king was the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt, Israel's old enemy. This alliance indicates that Egypt had slipped much lower on the international scene and that Israel was now much higher, because Egyptian rulers did not give their kings their daughters in marriage to the rulers of other nations. It's significant that Solomon did not put his Egyptian wife into the royal palace where David had lived, because it was near the Ark of the Covenant, but he housed her in another place until her own palace was completed. He spent 7 years building the temple of God, but 13 years building his own palace. Solomon's complex system of treaties cut at the very heart of Israel's unique position as the people of God among the nations of the world. They were God's holy people, a chosen people among whom the Lord himself dwelt. God had made no covenants with the Gentile nations, nor had he given them his word, his sanctuary, or his priesthood. God said to the Jews in Leviticus 20, "I am the Lord your God who has separated you from other people." As long as Israel trusted the Lord and obeyed him, the nation would dwell safely alone. The prophet Balaam described Israel as a people dwelling alone, not reckoning itself among the nations. Numbers 23 and verse 9. The Lord placed Israel among the Gentile nations to be a witness to them of the true and living God, a light among the Gentiles, according to Isaiah 42 and verse 6. If Israel had continued to be faithful to the terms of God's covenant, the Lord would have blessed them and used them as an object lesson to the pagan nations around them. Instead, Israel imitated the Gentiles, worshiped their idols, and abandoned their witness to the true God. For that reason, God had to chasten them and send them into captivity in Babylon. God wanted Israel to be the head of the nations, but because of her compromise, she became the tail. Solomon may have thought that he was making political progress by bringing Israel into the family of nations, but the consequence was really spiritual regress. Solomon also entered into lucrative trade agreements with other nations, and the nation prospered, but the price he paid was too high. The kingdom of Israel prospered only as she trusted God and obeyed the terms of his covenant. If they were true to the Lord, he promised to give them all that they needed, to protect them from their enemies, and to bless their labors. But from the very beginning of the Jewish monarchy, Israel's leaders made it clear that they wanted to be like the other nations, 1 Samuel chapter 8. And Solomon led them closer to that goal. Ultimately, Solomon married many pagan wives and began to worship their false gods, and the Lord had to punish them. Next, in 1 Kings 3, we see Solomon as a builder. Solomon is remembered also as the king during whose reign the temple was built. His alliance with Hiram, king of Tyre, gave him access to fine timber and skilled workmen, but he also built his own palace, which seems to have consisted of living quarters plus the house of the forest of Lebanon, where arms or weapons were stored and displayed. It also consisted of the Hall of Pillars and the Hall of Judgment. He also built a house in Jerusalem for his Egyptian princess wife, 2 Chronicles 8 and verse 11. And official state visitors were overwhelmed by the splendor of these structures. Though he was not a warrior himself, Solomon was concerned about the security of the land. He expanded and strengthened the Milo, which was probably a protective wall or embankment that David had begun to build. Solomon also had a special interest in horses and chariots, and he built stables in special chariot cities. He became quite a horse dealer, and he imported horses and chariots and sold them to other nations, no doubt making a good profit on the sales. He also built store cities in strategic places. At that time, Israel controlled several important trade routes that needed to be protected, and military personnel were housed in these cities, along with supplies of food and weapons. Solomon violated the law of Moses, not only by marrying many wives, but also by multiplying horses and depending on chariots, Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 17. Contrary to God's command, Solomon went back to Egypt for both of these things. The king was required to copy out for himself the book of Deuteronomy, and we wonder how Solomon responded when he read the command about wives and horses. During Solomon's reign, the outward splendor and wealth of Israel only masked an inward decay that led eventually to division and then destruction. In 1 Kings 3, 2 through 15, we see Solomon the worshiper. Solomon certainly made a good beginning, for he loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father, according to verse 3. But a good beginning does not guarantee a good ending. Saul, the first king of Israel, started out with humility and victory, but he ended up being rejected by the Lord and committing suicide on the battlefield. Solomon himself would write in Ecclesiastes 7:8, "The end of a thing is better than its beginning, and a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth," chapter 7 and verse 1. We receive our name soon after birth, and between birth and death, we either enhance that name or debase it. After death, we can't change a bad name into a good name or a good name into a bad name. God had said that the people of Israel would have a central place of worship, and they would not imitate the nations in Canaan by building high places wherever they chose. When Israel entered the land, they were instructed to destroy these high places and the idols that were worshipped there. However, until the temple was built and centralized worship was established in the land, the people of Israel worshiped the Lord in the high places. In time, the phrase high place began to be used to mean a place of worship, and the Jews worshiped Jehovah at these temporary worship places. Gibeon was such a sacred place, one of these high places, for the tabernacle was located there. As a first step toward the construction of the tabernacle, David had moved the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, but the rest of the tabernacle, including the altar of sacrifice, was still at Gibeon, located 5 miles north of Jerusalem. Solomon assembled the leaders of Israel and arranged for them to go to Gibeon with him and worship the Lord. This event would not only be an act of consecration, but would manifest to the people the unity of the nation's leaders. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings to the Lord as he and his officers together praised the Lord and sought his face. The burnt offering pictured total dedication to the Lord. The assembly lasted all day, and the people remained at Gibeon for the night, including King Solomon, who was given a dream from the Lord. David had both Nathan and Gad as his counselors, but there seems to have been no prophet in Solomon's circle of advisors. Twice the Lord spoke to the king through dreams. The Lord sometimes communicated his message through dreams, not only to his own servants, but also to those of other nations, such as Abimelech in Genesis 20, the Egyptian servants of Pharaoh in Genesis 40, and Pharaoh himself in Genesis 41. Solomon heard the Lord say, "Ask, what shall I give you?" The Lord's command and question were a revelation of God's grace as well as a test of Solomon's heart. What people ask for usually reveals what they really desire, and what they desire depends on how they envision their life's calling. Had Solomon been a warrior, he might have asked for victory over his enemies, but he saw himself as a young leader who desperately needed wisdom so he could adequately serve God's chosen people. He had succeeded David, Israel's greatest king, and Solomon knew that the people couldn't help but compare and contrast father and son. But even more, he had been called to build the temple of the Lord, an awesome task for such an inexperienced leader. Solomon knew he could not accomplish that great venture without wisdom from heaven. Solomon's prayer was brief and to the point, and it was spoken with true humility, for 3 times he calls himself your servant. First, Solomon reviewed the past and thanked God for the faithfulness and steadfast love shown to his father. Solomon acknowledged God's goodness in keeping his father through many trials, and then giving him a son to inherit his throne. Solomon is referring here to the covenant that God gave to David when he expressed his heart's desire to build a temple for God. In that covenant, God promised David a son who would build the temple, and Solomon was that son. Solomon admitted that he wasn't the king because God recognized his abilities, but because God kept his promises to his father David. Then Solomon moved into the present and acknowledged God's grace in making him king. But he also confessed his youthfulness and inexperience, and therefore his desperate need for God's help if he was to succeed as Israel's king. Solomon was probably 20 years old or so at this time, and certainly much younger than his advisors and officers, some of whom had served his father. He called himself inexperienced, a mark of both honesty and humility. Sadly, the one word that is translated little child in some translations is seriously misunderstood by many translators. It is the same word that we've talked about concerning David and the song about little boy David. In the case of David, and here in the case of Solomon, it simply means inexperienced. As we've already said, Solomon is probably about 20 years old, and thus is not a little child. Then the phrase to go out or to come in refers to giving leadership to the nation. In his prayer, the king not only confessed his own inexperience, but also the nation's greatness. The people of Israel were the people of God. This meant that God had a great purpose for them to fulfill on earth, and that their king carried a great responsibility in ruling them. God had multiplied the nation and fulfilled his promise to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and to Solomon. And Solomon wanted the blessing to continue. The king concluded his prayer by anticipating the future and asking the Lord for the wisdom needed to rule the nation. Wisdom was an important element in Near Eastern life, and every king had his circle of wise men who advised him. But Solomon didn't ask for a committee of wise counselors. He asked for wisdom for himself. In that day, the wise person was one who was skillful in the management of life. It meant much more than the ability to make a living. It meant the ability to make a life and make the most out of what life might bring. True wisdom involves skill in human relationships, as well as the ability to understand and cooperate with the basic laws that God has built into his creation. Wise people not only have knowledge of human nature and of the created world, but they know how to use that knowledge in the right way at the right time. Wisdom is not a theoretical idea or an abstract commodity. It's very practical and it's very personal. There are many people who are smart enough to make a good living, but they aren't wise enough to make a good life, a life of fulfillment that honors the Lord. Solomon asked God to give him an understanding heart, because no matter how smart the mind may be, if the heart is wrong, all of life will be wrong. Proverbs 4:23 says, "Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it spring the issues of life." The word translated understanding means hearing. Solomon wanted a hearing heart. True understanding comes from hearing what God has to say. And to the Old Testament Jew, hearing meant obeying. When the Lord speaks to us through his word, it's not that we might study and pass judgment on what he said, but that we might obey what he said. An understanding heart has insight and exercises discernment. It knows what is real and what is artificial, and what is temporal and what is eternal. God was pleased with Solomon's request for wisdom because it showed that the king was concerned with serving God and his people by knowing and doing God's will. The result was that the Lord gave to him the additional blessings that he did not ask for. God always gives his best to those who leave the choice with him. When you read the book of Proverbs, you find that the love of wisdom and the practice of discernment can lead to these extra blessings. In the subsequent chapters, we will learn about Solomon's wealth and honor and how he attracted visitors from other nations who wanted to hear his wisdom. The Lord was careful to remind Solomon that his obedience to God's covenant and his devotion to the Lord were the keys to his future blessings. Solomon was required to write out, as we've said, his own personal copy of the law. And this would include the covenant spelled out in Deuteronomy chapters 28 through 30. Solomon also knew the terms of the covenant that God made with his father David. and it required obedience on the part of David's son and successor. God promised to lengthen Solomon's life if he obeyed the word, for he would be honoring God and his father David, and could claim the promise of Exodus 20 and verse 12. It's unfortunate that Solomon, with all his wisdom, forgot this part of the agreement and gradually drifted into sin and disobedience, and God had to chasten him. When Solomon returned to Jerusalem, he went to the tent that housed the ark, and there he offered more sacrifices. The ark represented the presence of God among his people and the rule of God over his people. Solomon acknowledged the sovereign rule of God over his own life and the life of the nation. In other words, Solomon knew that he was second in command. It was when he started to forget that basic truth that he got himself into trouble. This brings us to 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 16 through 28, where we see that Solomon is a discerning man. God's chosen leaders cannot always remain on the heights of spiritual glory, but must take that glory and blessing with them into the place of duty and service. Solomon had been worshiping at Gibeon and Jerusalem, but now he has returned to the responsibilities of the throne. Like his father David, Solomon gave the common people access to the king. God had given Solomon a special gift of wisdom, and now he could put it to use. He had stood before the ark, the throne of God, and now his people could stand before his throne and seek help. Two prostitutes bring a matter before the king. Although prostitution seemed to be tolerated in Israel, the law of Moses laid down some severe restrictions and punishments. The book of Proverbs warned young men about the wiles of the harlot, the strange woman, and Paul instructed Christians to avoid prostitutes in 1 Corinthians 6, 15 and 16. These two women lived together with other prostitutes in a house of prostitution. They became pregnant about the same time, and they both delivered babies. One baby died, and the other was claimed by the mother of the dead child. Since there were no witnesses to the birth of the two babies or the death of the one, the case couldn't be tried in the courts in the normal way. It would be one woman's word against the word of the other, even though it was obvious that one of the women was a liar. Using the divine wisdom God gave him, Solomon bypassed the word of the women and went right to their hearts. For the heart of every problem is the problem in the heart. By suggesting that they divide the baby between them, Solomon revealed the heart of the true mother and gave her baby to her. In 1 Kings 4, 1 through 28, we see Solomon as an administrator. David was a gifted administrator, and his son inherited some of that ability. Even though Solomon had great wisdom and authority, he couldn't handle the affairs of the kingdom alone. The good leader chooses capable associates and allows them to use their own gifts and thereby serve the Lord. In verses 1 through 6, we see some special officers chosen. Azariah was the high priest. He was the son of Ahimaaz and the grandson of Zadok, the priest who had served David so faithfully. It appears that Ahimaaz had died, and therefore his son was given the office. While David had only one scribe, Solomon had two, and they were the sons of David's scribe, Shisha. He was also known as Sariah, Shiva, and Shavsha. Solomon's kingdom was much larger and more complex than that over which his father ruled, so the keeping of records would have been more demanding. Jehoshaphat had been recorder during David's reign, and Benaiah had been appointed head of the army by Solomon. Abiathar had been exiled because of his part in the plot involving Adonijah, and Zadok had died and been replaced by his grandson. Since both Zadok and Abiathar had served with David, they are found in the official roster. Azariah was in charge of the 12 officers who supervised the 12 districts that Solomon had marked out in Israel. Whether his father was Nathan the prophet, Nathan the son of David, or another man named Nathan is not explained. Nathan was a popular name in Israel. Zabud was a priest who served as special advisor to the king. Ahishar managed the complex affairs of the king's household, and Adoniram was in charge of the men who were drafted to labor in the public works of the kingdom. These would not be Israelites, but foreigners in the land, that is, the ones who were working on the public works. However, in the building of the temple, Solomon did conscript Israelites to devote 4 months a year to public service. Adoniram was also known as Adoram, and he was stoned to death by the people when Rehoboam became king in 1 Kings 12. Samuel had warned the people that their king would do such things in 1 Samuel 8. Next, we see some special commissioners. Solomon marked out 12 districts of various sizes, and he put a commissioner over each district. The boundaries of the districts ignored the traditional boundaries of the tribes and even incorporated territory that David had taken in battle. And each district was to provide food for the king's household for 1 month. By establishing new districts that crossed over old boundaries, Solomon may have hoped to minimize tribal loyalty and eliminate some of the tension between Judah and the northern tribes. Instead, the plan only aggravated the tension, particularly since Judah was not included in the redistricting program. Being the royal tribe that contained the royal city, Judah was administered separately. Any king with 700 wives and 300 concubines, plus numerous officers and frequent guests, would have a large household to feed. According to verses 22 and 23, the meals for 1 day in the palace required 185 bushels of fine flour, 375 bushels of coarse meal, 10 oxen fattened in the stall, and 20 oxen from the pasture, 100 sheep, and various kinds of game and fowl. Solomon also needed grain for his many horses, which may have been how the barley was used. The conquered nations may have looked upon these monthly donations as part of their tribute to King Solomon, but the Jewish tribes considered the whole system to be a humiliating form of extortion. After Solomon's death, it was no wonder that the 10 tribes rose up in revolt. For some reason, 5 of the commissioners are identified by their fathers, because the word ben in Hebrew means son of. The son of Abinadab may have been a son of David's own brother, and therefore a cousin to Solomon. He also married one of Solomon's daughters, as also did Ahimaaz. It's likely that Solomon instituted this supply system several years into his reign, since he didn't have adult children when he was crowned. Baanah was probably a brother to Jehoshaphat the recorder. These 12 men had great power in the land and were a part of the corrupt bureaucracy that Solomon wrote about in Ecclesiastes 5, verses 8 through 12. In verses 20 through 28, we see some special distinctions. The nation of Israel became famous for its large population, its peace and security, its buildings, its wise king, and its satisfying lifestyle. Of course, the population grew because of God's promise to the patriarchs and his promises in the covenant. The enlarged territory was also a part of God's promise. The nation submitted to Solomon's rule and brought him gifts and tribute annually. And Solomon enjoyed great blessing because of God's covenant with David. Contrary to God's law, Solomon multiplied horses in the land, as we have seen, and built special cities for housing them. Even though we haven't finished chapter 4, we're going to have to stop here because we're a little bit over an hour. We'll pick up with 1 Kings 4, verse 29 when we come back in session 27. But as always, if you ever have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Thank you.